Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our roundtable of guests for today. We have Mr. Todd McFarland, who's the Deputy General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Mr. Tim Schultz, who's president of the First Amendment Partnership. We have Dr. Lawrence Brown, who's the Assistant Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Northeastern Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have Dr. Timothy Golden, who's a visiting professor of philosophy at Whitman College. Gentlemen, looking forward to our conversation for today. You know, if you ever found yourself visiting the Iowa State House, maybe around the holiday season, you would sometimes see what we would call a display that has been set up by the Satanic Temple. It features a ram's head covered with mirrors on a mannequin cloaked in red clothing. You know, the co-founder of the Satanic Temple says that the satanic display is just a symbol of their right to religious freedom. They want to go forward and have the opportunity to represent their quote unquote religious beliefs in a public forum. They believe that we should have every right that any other religious group has, and that the feelings of some people may be uncomfortable with the idea of seeing a satanic display. But when you think about what's going on from a local perspective, some people may say, I don't like that. But then from a federal perspective, how do you take something out of a rotunda that may be displaying satanic activities, but you're okay if you have the nativity scene taking place? You know, Tim Golden, on one hand, I understand the idea of this, but I have to say maybe my personal feeling is a little bit uncomfortable when around the holiday season, probably going into a public area and having to see the Satanic Temple setting up for the holiday season. And is it just maybe my own personal issues, or the reality is that if you're a religious organization and they let one group in, you just can't stop the other group from being in?
Well, I think democracy is uncomfortable. Right? There's a lot of things that make us uncomfortable about democracy, but we have reasons why we still allow people to have free speech in spite of the fact that what they say or the images that they display make us uncomfortable. One of the things I noticed about this case is that the Iowa governor, Kim Reynolds, she couches this as a free speech issue. She's quoted as saying one of the best remedies for objectionable speech is more speech. Here's the question I'm asking, and I'll defer to my distinguished jurists here on this panel. I'm wondering if a court viewed, if the satanic display was not allowed and there was a lawsuit filed in the federal court, and the state argued that although this was a content-based restriction on free speech, because of Satanism's connection to certain violent crimes and different acts and cult-like behavior in society, we nevertheless have a compelling state interest to disallow this speech. Again, I'll defer to my colleagues here, but I'm curious as to how far or whether or not the state would be successful with that kind of argument, because I know in free speech cases, we distinguish between those that are content-based and those that are content neutral, and there's a different standard of review. So I sort of ran that through my own head, and I'm curious as to what my other panelists would think about that argument.
So here's the thing. There are few times when you can get almost everybody in the room to line up on the same time. But there are those rare moments when even the Supreme Court votes unanimously on something. And yes, I believe in free speech. Yes, I believe that in democracy, sometimes it's not always pretty, it's not always clean. But I think this is one of those moments where you could probably get almost everybody in the room to line up behind the fact that nobody is a big fan of Satan. Now, listen, having said that, I'm not trying to, get rid of free speech or anything like that. But just like during the pandemic, I had to remind some of my friends that when you have the rare emergency that is so large that it warrants action that otherwise would not, be accepted, just so there are times when a group is so universally abhorred that you can probably get everybody to say, yeah, that's a bridge too far. I'm not going there. Satan, you stay home.
But Tim Schultz, they say that they are federally recognized, organization. I mean, the idea that, we may be uncomfortable with it, or maybe even our vision of what satanic worship really is may actually be skewed. From their perspective, we're just another mainstream operation, and why should we be pushed out? Am I missing something here, or should we not see the Schultz family and their kids, recognizing Satan when they come to the State House? I don't know.
So I have three thoughts. First, I'm anti-Satan. Okay. I'm personally opposed to Satan. I want to just put that out there right now.
Right.
Okay?
Me too.
Yeah. Number two, I think that if you think about First Amendment principles, there are lots of absolutely toxic things that are protected by the First Amendment, toxic religious beliefs. We think of the marches that Westboro Baptist Church has done, right? We can think of the infamous Nazi march in Skokie, Illinois, right? There are terrible things that are universally reviled by a civilized people that are nonetheless protected by the First Amendment. Now, I don't think that gets us all the way to the answer on this question, because this is a public forum case where they're saying because you're allowing other kinds of religious symbolism, you can't just prioritize Christianity. The court's jurisprudence on this, I think, is kind of wrong. But what we have is this idea that if you allow Christian symbols, you have to allow other religious symbols alongside it. They're opening it up as a public forum, and you get this so-called satanic thing. My take on this is that I personally think that the satanic, church or whatever is just an act of trollery. I don't believe that it's a sincerely held religious belief. I really don't. I think they set it up as a way of trolling Christianity. And so I think that applying a kind of sincerity analysis to this would be the better way to go. If you think that this is suspicious, it's because it is. These are not active Satanists. They're people who were using Satanism to test a principle, and they're doing it in a kind of juvenile and trollish way. Now, I think it's always best to laugh at Satan, because Satan actually being a supreme narcissist, right? What you do is you laugh at narcissists. They hate that. Satan, in my religious beliefs, has lost. I believe he's real, but I believe he's lost. And as the hymn goes, his fate is sure, right? And I think laughing at Satan is kind of the way to go. But I also think that this is an act of trollery, not an act of sincerely held religious beliefs. And I think that's the better way to think about this. I'd really be interested to hear what Todd has to say, though.
Todd.
Yeah, I agree with Tim Schultz. I think the answer to Dr. Golden's response is, I think that would be a very slippery, I think it would not even be a slippery slope. I think it would be a very problematic slope to say, well, Satanism is associated with certain behavior and so forth, because the reality is Christianity hasn't had in its couple thousand-year history the best record, at times as far as violence being done in its name. But yeah, Satanism, and they've filed these lawsuits around the country. People have challenged the sincerity of it in court. Courts have been very hesitant and reluctant, I think probably appropriately, to do that. But I think at the end of the day, all they do is litigation. It's you cannot show up to, your local Satanists on a weekday or Saturday or Sunday or whatever day they would worship. It isn't really clear what they do other than just sue, because, they clearly don't like Christianity. But unless you're just going to ding them on sincerity, which is a tough thing to do, and I think you have no choice but to allow them to put these, you open up these limited public forums like in the state capitol, and we'll talk about this later. Arkansas had the same thing with some commandment or monuments on its state grounds. Don't be surprised when they roll up with their iconography.
But Todd, I got to ask you this question. You're somebody who has represented all kinds of groups. The Satanic Temple group come to you and say, Todd, we need you to kind of help us to protect our religious freedom. I mean, where do you go on that?
Well, the answer would be no, and for two reasons. Well, first of all, we don't, my organization doesn't take all cases, right? And second, we would not take a case of a group, like I said, that I believe really is not about sincerity, belief, but just is really just trolling people and just doing this for the sole purpose of litigation. So that would not be an organization that we would agree with. And I don't think you need to be apologetic for that. It's not just about the beliefs, which we firmly disagree with, but it's also sort of the nature and what it is, and that is an organization designed not really to spread any type of truth, but just simply to go around and upset people.
Yeah, and if I could just chime in here, I'm glad thank you, Todd, for your perspective on that hypothetical. But I think that both Tim and Todd and Dr. Brown, frankly, make very compelling points, which is that there's a lot of things that are objectionable, a lot of things we don't like. I mean, there have been times when the Ku Klux Klan has purported to be and purports to be a Christian organization, right? But we don't accept them in mainstream Christianity. So, yeah, it makes us uncomfortable. We don't like it, but welcome to America, right? Where lots of things make us uncomfortable and there's lots of things that we don't like. And to pick up on Todd's point, Christianity hasn't always had the best history of behavior as it relates to violence. So yeah, we don't like it. It makes us uncomfortable, but ultimately this is American democracy and we've committed ourselves to protecting free speech in ways that cause exactly these types of scenarios. And so,
If I can, I want to push back though. You keep saying a democracy, and to some extent, this is very anti-democratic, right? Because
what is anti-democratic?
Well, no, allowing, forcing the state of Iowa to have this display. If you put this to a vote, either with the representatives or a direct plebiscite, there's no question that would lose. I think it's more of a Republican form where you have certain guaranteed rights and it actually overrides the democracy is what we have here, because a pure democratic system would exclude the Satanists 10 out of 10 times. But because we have a First Amendment that serves as a barrier to democracy, saying, listen, your elected representatives can't do this, no matter how popular or how democratically advantageous this would be, you are restricted. And so, yeah, I don't think the United States was not set up as a pure democracy, right? I mean, just going back political science, it is a Republican form of government. I know you don't like that word. I'm using it in the small r form, just to be clear. But that's, I think, a distinction that's important here.
Well, Todd, thank you for that lesson in political theory. When I use the word or the phrase American democracy, I'm not talking about democracy in the pure Athenian sense. I'm talking about the precise kind of democracy that you just described, one in which the popular vote is not definitive or conclusive as to certain outcomes in politics. So, yes, people do have the right to vote. Yes, if this was a pure democracy, it probably wouldn't turn out the way that we're talking about here. But that's not what America is. And so I know that and I understand that. And when I say American democracy, I mean a constitutional republic, lowercase r.
Frequently, people who use the term American democracy are using it in the colloquial sense, not in the the civics sense. And so I understood Dr. Golden to be using it in the former rather than the latter.
Well, gentlemen, I'm going to let that be the last word. And whether we're talking about the big R or the little r, I think at the end of the day, the real question we're going to have to end up grappling with, if you left one group in the House, how do you stop another group from being in the House? And that may be what we'll see in the court system when it's all said and done. But, appreciate all the comments on that one. I was looking at an interesting case kind of following up with our conversation, which was entitled The Satanic Temple versus the Saucon Valley School District. And this was a lawsuit that was filed in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. And basically what we have here is we have an entity, which is a school district, that is refusing to allow equal access to some of its school facilities because there's a group that actually has a viewpoint from a religious standpoint that they're uncomfortable with. Even in the concept of thinking about free speech clause, the First Amendment that basically prohibits the government from censoring certain speeches. But it looks like we have a situation here where we have a school district that's uncomfortable with some of the principles of this Satanic Temple. And as a result, they're denying a group permission to actually have access. You know, Todd, when you take a look at this case, and this is one of the things that we've been talking about in particular on this show, what do you do when, you know, maybe the majority of who we are uncomfortable, but the reality is that, you know, when you're putting nativity scenes and other things in place, it's also making a segment of our society uncomfortable. I actually found myself one day on a conversation and talk show with multiple different people from religious groups, and somebody from the Satanic Temple was part of the grouping there, and the conversation actually didn't seem that crazy to me. So on one hand, you know, my heart may tell me something, but maybe the realities aren't telling me that I'm looking at this the right way. But when you see a case like this, how do we jump in and make sure that we're drawing the lines with the right principles and maybe not allowing our personal beliefs to carry the day?
So just to sort of lay a little bit of foundation here, this is about access to after-school clubs, right? So back in the 1980s, there was a case called Good News Club. There was eventually some federal legislation passed, and it essentially says that schools, if they're going to have after-school clubs, especially ones that aren't directly tied to a curricular activity, then they have to open it up generally. And they can put requirements on there. It's not like you can let the middle schoolers just, you know, go wild in a classroom. There has to be a sponsor. It has to tie in and so forth. But this was designed to give, at the time, Christian groups access to an after-school Bible study, which was similar to other curricula or co-curricular after-school activities that were being opened up for. And so that passed. There was a lot of success in litigation there. Interestingly, that same access law and same precedent allowed for after-school LGBT or support groups, straight gay alliances, et cetera. And now we sort of see the third iteration of that with the Satanic group. I have not handling this case, not really looked, not looked at any of the briefing. What it seems to be is they denied them on what the Satanic is saying as a pretextual, saying, well, you didn't have this one little thing here in your application. The Satanic Club is saying, well, neither did anyone else, so you can't treat us differently. But this is the challenge with opening up your after-school programs. I don't see this being like our first case where the Satanic Temple is going to, be putting up monuments around state houses or in state capitals, simply because, first of all, you need students that actually want to participate in this, and you need a faculty sponsor or someone else who's going to sponsor this. And I think that's going to have a limiting principle here. You can also make sure, and this goes to your prior conversation, that whatever the views are, while you can't be content-based, you can make sure that, they're not advocating for genocide or death or something that, that would violate good public order in sort of a very strict sense. So, yeah, I think this puts the school district in a very difficult position, but it's not a problem I see became widespread because of those two limiting factors of faculty sponsor and students wanting to participate.
Well, here's something I want to point out, and I'm going to try to be as kind as I can with my statements here. We have always been a mixed demographic as a nation. But I think you all will agree with me that while there was a time when those who perhaps were not as savvy in the dynamics of democracy and how these things work, there once was a time when certain concepts may not have been easily grasped by certain people. And those folks were content to, for the most part, stay quiet. Where we are now and where we live now, people who perhaps don't understand all the nuances of how government works have no compunction at all about seizing on the things that they think are so far beyond the pale that they are a classic example of how broken the system has gotten. And that's why when it comes to topics like this, we're in a day and time where if people seem to think that Satan is somehow getting a foothold in, they have no problem being uber vocal and, lambasting everything and everybody. And even people running for office seize on certain things and use it to whip up the base and whip up the masses. So the only reason why on some topics, I think we should proceed with caution is because today, those who are not the sharpest knives in the drawer are no longer content to just sit there and just have a conversation in the barbershop anymore. Now it flows out into a wider sphere. And I just think there are some topics where for the greater good, you just need to say, you know what? Yeah, we're not going to engage this one. And listen, a few years from now might be different, but the fact remains where we are, people who have no clue about how good government works, their ignorance does not keep them silent. And when they open their mouths, there are people running for office, perhaps even the highest office in the land, who love to seize on these things and just move people the direction they want them to go because of the shock value and the shock factor.
But Tim Schultz, how do you get around the concept that if you look at this, that this could be simply just a pretext to discrimination? You know, the idea that, you know, based on the feeling of maybe somebody who's in what I would call an administrative position at this school district who's just generally uncomfortable, it doesn't put everyone on a level playing field regardless of what the thought process is. Atheists are not happy about seeing nativity scenes when they go places. People who have different points of view don't understand why when we talk about a day of worship, a lot of society thinks that must be Sunday. All of this stuff makes us uncomfortable. And so, you know, the idea that this could be just simply a pretext to discrimination, that troubles me. And I don't know how you balance that.
I think there are kind of two interesting things happening here if you kind of zoom up to a 30,000-foot level, Orlin. One of them is it's this question of, are we going to privilege Christianity among American religions? Okay. And there are people who think that way. And I think the problem with that is, one, it runs afoul of the First Amendment, properly understood. But just on a practical level, what kinds of Christianity are we talking about, right? Christian groups that are smaller or historically smaller, like Adventists, tend to come out on the very short end of the stick when you start saying we're going to privilege Christianity. And then if you say, well, we're going to privilege the Judeo-Christian tradition, right, in a country like ours, then that creates problems too. So that whole theory that we're going to privilege one religious group or one religious sect over others, that runs into all kinds of problems. But then you say, well, we have to be completely secular. Well, that runs into problems too, because it means that you're really, secularism is itself a philosophy. It's unprovable. It involves leaps of faith, just as lavish as religious people make. And so what you're doing is essentially declaring a kind of state religion of secularism, right? So that's part of the issue of what we're talking about here. And I think it's just important to kind of zoom up and sort of think of that at the theory level. So second thing is, because of our internet culture, right, we live in an era of mass trollery, right? We see it everywhere, but I think it's been emboldened by the anonymity of the internet. And I don't think it's surprising that what I think is a kind of professional religious troll operation, this sort of litigation-only satanic so-called clubs, which don't seem to really exist in reality. They don't seem to have real parishioners, right? That this kind of thing would proliferate in the era of litigation for sport, right? And sort of in a culture of mass trollery. And I think that's the other thing that's going on here. I'd be interested to hear what Dr. Golden has to say, though.
Yeah, and taking up on your point, Tim, this suit, as I understand it, was it brought under the Equal Access Act? I guess it would have been brought under that federal statute.
Yep.
Correct.
Good law, too.
Yeah. The statute that Todd referenced at the beginning. You know, I'm listening to you, Tim, speak of trollery, and I'm wondering about the infamous Rule 11 sanctions, right? I'm wondering if people are really bringing baseless claims just to, I mean, arguably, you know, you may have a good faith claim, but I'm wondering if you exist as a religious group, putting religion in quotes, and you're not really there to hold any sincere beliefs, but you're just there to litigate and put forth test cases, then, you know, I'm wondering if there isn't some kind of restraint on this sort of litigation that we find already built into the system.
Todd pointed out earlier, and I think he's right, that courts have been very careful
Absolutely.
about getting too intrusive about, sincerity tests, because you really don't want courts. Sometimes that really easily crosses the line into, asking how legitimate the religious belief is. When you press too hard into the sincerity question, we don't want courts doing that. And it's somewhat the same, I think, with Rule 11. I think, Rule 11, there's all kinds of vexatious litigation that never faces Rule 11 sanctions. And I think it's because we want people to be able to make what are sometimes in the law called colorable arguments. And if you can make a colorable argument, we don't want to sanction lawyers for that. Again, that's a kind of legal profession, decision. So I'm with you on, I think your thought processes on this make a lot of sense, but I think that there are reasons why both the sincerity test and Rule 11 are used with some trepidation because they are extremely strong medicine in both cases.
I'm going to have to let that be the last word on that. But the one thing I will say is we're going to find ourselves really finding a court system that may be really starting to talk about what's a real religion and what's not a real religion. And I think that's when it's going to really start to get interesting. Tim Golden, tell me something I don't know.
Well, with both major presidential candidates wrapping up their nominations, get ready for a long spring, a long hot summer, and a long fall season full of scandalous TV ads and endless political debate, culminating in an election that will result in who knows what. So we'll see what happens, but get ready for lots of long, ugly political debate and discussion the rest of 2024.
Gearing up. Lawrence, tell me something I don't know.
The Church of Satan was founded April 30th, 1966. However, looking at how goofy things have been in this world, I think their adherents have been around a little longer than that.
Little longer than that, probably. Todd, tell me something I don't know.
When the state of Arkansas created a monuments commission to look at, really to set up a Ten Commandments monument on its state capitol, two things happened. First, they put up a Ten Commandments monument, and within 24 hours, a mentally ill gentleman took a car to it and literally ran over the Ten Commandments. He did it so quickly, ACLU couldn't even get their lawsuit on file. And the second thing that happened is the Satanists made an application to the same commission asking to put up their monument.
Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
Vince Gilligan, the creator of the TV series Breaking Bad, and the iconic villain Walter White, has been quoted as saying, "I'm not sure if I believe in God, but I definitely believe in the devil."
Well, gentlemen, thanks a lot for being here with us. Really enjoyed our conversation for today. Thanks again for you being here. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.